In just a few seconds, this calm exchange transformed into something far more serious and unexpected. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins the way many segments on The View typically do, with a calm introduction and a conversational tone that feels familiar to regular viewers. The panel is seated, the audience is attentive, and the discussion is framed around a recent project involving Nicolas Cage, who has joined the hosts for an in-studio interview. From the outset, the atmosphere is respectful, even slightly warm, as the hosts acknowledge his long-standing career and his recent return to more character-driven roles. Sunny Hostin begins by setting the tone with a thoughtful question, referencing Cage's recent interviews where he spoke about artistic choices and the direction of his career. Her delivery is measured and professional, as viewers would expect. She leans slightly forward, maintaining eye contact, signaling genuine engagement rather than confrontation. Cage, seated comfortably, listens without interruption, occasionally nodding. At this stage, everything appears routine. Cage responds in a calm and reflective manner, discussing how his approach to acting has evolved over time. He speaks about balancing commercial projects with more personal work, emphasizing that his decisions are often guided by instinct rather than external expectations. His tone is steady, and his body language remains relaxed, hands loosely folded as he explains his perspective. The conversation then shifts slightly, as Sunny Hostin introduces a more pointed observation. She references criticism that has followed Cage over the years, particularly regarding some of his film choices. Her phrasing remains careful, but there is a noticeable shift in the nature of the discussion. Instead of purely highlighting his achievements, she brings up how some critics have questioned the consistency of his career. There is a brief pause after her comment. It's not long, but it's enough to register with viewers. Cage maintains composure, but his posture changes slightly. He leans back a bit, his expression becoming more focused. This is the first subtle indication that the conversation may be moving into more serious territory. He responds by acknowledging that criticism is part of any public-facing career. His tone remains even, but there is a firmness in how he frames his answer. He explains that he has always approached his work with intention, even when those choices may not have aligned with mainstream expectations. He emphasizes that acting, for him, is not just about maintaining a certain image but about exploring a range of creative opportunities. As he speaks, the rest of the panel listens closely. There are no interruptions at this point, but the dynamic has clearly shifted. What started as a light, reflective conversation is now becoming more analytical. Sunny Hostin follows up, this time asking whether he believes that public perception has ever affected the types of roles he chooses. Her tone is still composed, but the question carries a bit more weight. It suggests a deeper examination of how external opinions might influence personal decisions. Cage takes a moment before answering. He looks briefly toward the audience, then back at the panel. This pause feels deliberate, as if he is choosing his words carefully. He responds by saying that while he is aware of public perception, he does not allow it to dictate his choices. His voice is calm, but there is a noticeable emphasis on certain words, particularly when he speaks about independence and artistic integrity. He explains that his career has been shaped by a willingness to take risks, even if those risks are not always understood at the time. At this point, another host briefly nods in agreement, adding a short comment about how taking risks is part of staying relevant in the entertainment industry. The audience responds with light applause, which momentarily softens the tension. However, Sunny Hostin returns to the discussion with another question, one that builds directly on her previous point. She asks whether there have been moments where Cage has reconsidered certain roles in hindsight, especially those that received negative reception. The phrasing is still professional, but the repetition of the theme, questioning past decisions, begins to create a more pointed line of inquiry. Cage's reaction is subtle but noticeable. He shifts slightly in his seat, his expression becoming more serious. When he answers, his tone remains controlled, but there is a clearer sense of firmness. He states that every role he has taken has contributed to his growth as an actor, regardless of how it was received. He avoids dismissing criticism outright, but makes it clear that he does not view his career through the same lens as critics. The exchange remains respectful, but there is now an underlying tension that wasn't present at the beginning. It's the kind of shift that regular viewers of The View can recognize, a conversation that is still within the bounds of daytime television, but moving into more serious territory. Sunny Hostin listens carefully to his response, then adds a final remark that slightly reframes the discussion. She mentions that public figures often have to balance personal expression with audience expectations, and she asks whether Cage feels any responsibility to meet those expectations. This is the moment where the tone changes more noticeably. Cage does not interrupt, but his response comes with a more direct energy. He maintains eye contact and speaks clearly, emphasizing that his responsibility is first to the work itself. He explains that trying to meet every expectation would ultimately limit creativity, and that his focus has always been on authenticity rather than approval. The firmness in his response is evident, but it is not confrontational. It's measured, controlled, and clearly articulated. The audience reacts with a mix of quiet attention and a few scattered claps, indicating that they recognize the shift in tone. The other hosts begin to engage more actively at this point, sensing that the conversation has reached a more serious level. One of them briefly interjects to acknowledge Cage's perspective, helping to keep the discussion balanced. This intervention serves to ease the tension slightly, but it doesn't fully reset the dynamic. As the segment continues, it becomes clear that what started as a routine interview has evolved into a more nuanced exchange. The disagreement is not overt or dramatic, but it is present in the differing perspectives being expressed. Sunny Hostin's questions remain thoughtful and structured, while Cage's responses grow increasingly firm, reflecting his desire to clarify his position. For viewers watching live, this moment stands out not because of any raised voices or overt conflict, but because of the subtle shift in tone and the way both participants hold their ground. It's the kind of exchange that feels real, two individuals discussing a complex topic with different viewpoints, navigating the conversation in real time. And as the discussion moves forward, the balance between maintaining a respectful dialogue and addressing the underlying tension becomes the central focus, setting the stage for what unfolds next. As the conversation continues, the shift that began in the earlier exchange doesn't fade. It settles into the rhythm of the segment. The tone remains controlled, but there is now a clear sense that both Nicolas Cage and Sunny Hostin are approaching the discussion with more intention. What had started as a general conversation about career choices is now centered on how those choices are interpreted, both by critics and by the public. Cage sits upright now, no longer leaning back as he had at the beginning of the segment. His posture reflects engagement, but also a readiness to respond carefully. Hostin, on the other hand, maintains her composed demeanor, occasionally glancing at her notes before returning her attention directly to him. The rest of the panel remains attentive, with subtle shifts in body language indicating that they are aware of the evolving dynamic. One of the co-hosts steps in briefly, offering a more neutral perspective on how actors are often judged more harshly when they experiment with different genres or roles. The comment is measured and seems intended to create some balance in the discussion. There's a small ripple of agreement from the audience, followed by light applause. For a moment, it appears as though the conversation might pivot back to a broader, less pointed tone. However, Hostin brings the focus back with a follow-up that builds directly on Cage's earlier remarks about artistic independence. She acknowledges his point about authenticity but raises the idea that public figures, especially those with long careers, inevitably become part of a larger cultural conversation. Her question is framed carefully, asking whether he believes that audience expectations are something that should at least be considered, even if they don't dictate decisions. There is a brief pause before Cage responds. He nods slightly, as if acknowledging the validity of the question, but his expression remains serious. When he speaks, his tone is steady, but there is a noticeable clarity in how he structures his answer. He explains that while he understands the role of the audience, he sees his responsibility differently. For him, the primary commitment is to the craft itself, not to external narratives about what his career should look like. As he elaborates, he uses measured language, avoiding any dismissive phrasing. He points out that the idea of consistency can mean different things depending on perspective. From his point of view, consistency lies in the commitment to the work, not in repeating the same type of role or meeting a fixed set of expectations. His delivery is calm, but the firmness that emerged earlier is still present. Hostin listens without interruption, maintaining eye contact. When he finishes, she responds with a slight nod, but her next comment introduces another layer to the discussion. She references how audiences often feel a sense of connection to public figures, which can lead to expectations that go beyond professional performance. Her tone remains even, but the framing suggests a subtle challenge to Cage's position. At this point, the exchange becomes more precise. It's no longer just about general ideas, it's about how those ideas apply in practice. Cage responds by acknowledging that connection, but he draws a clear line between appreciation and obligation. He explains that while he values the audience's support, he does not believe that connection should limit creative exploration. The way he delivers this response is notable. He doesn't raise his voice or interrupt, but there is a slight emphasis on certain phrases, particularly when he speaks about creative freedom and personal direction. His hands move minimally, but enough to underscore his points. The overall effect is one of controlled assertiveness. The audience remains quiet during this part of the exchange, which is typical for moments that require more attention. There are no immediate reactions, no laughter or applause, just focused listening. It's the kind of silence that often accompanies more serious discussions on The View. Another co-host steps in again, this time attempting to broaden the conversation. She asks Cage about how his approach has changed over time, particularly in response to the evolving nature of the entertainment industry. This question provides a slight shift in direction, allowing Cage to speak more generally again. He takes the opportunity to reflect on how the industry has changed, noting that there are now more platforms and opportunities for storytelling than ever before. He speaks about how this has allowed him to explore different types of roles that might not have been as accessible earlier in his career. His tone softens slightly here, becoming more reflective again. For a brief moment, the tension eases. The audience responds with a small round of applause, and there is a sense that the segment might be moving back toward a more neutral space. But the shift is temporary. Hostin re-enters the discussion, connecting his comments about the industry back to the earlier topic. She asks whether the increased number of platforms has also increased the level of scrutiny that actors face, particularly when it comes to public perception. Her question is thoughtful, but it brings the conversation back to the central tension. Cage's reaction is subtle but telling. He nods once, then leans slightly forward before answering. His tone remains composed, but there is a renewed firmness. He agrees that scrutiny has increased, but he frames it as a natural part of being in the public eye rather than something that should dictate creative decisions. He explains that the ability to take risks is even more important in an environment where there is so much content competing for attention. According to him, playing it safe would ultimately be less effective, both artistically and professionally. His delivery is clear and deliberate, with a focus on maintaining a consistent message. At this stage, the exchange has developed into a steady back and forth. It's not confrontational in the traditional sense, but there is a clear difference in perspective that neither side is stepping away from. Hostin continues to ask questions that probe the balance between personal choice and public expectation, while Cage consistently reinforces his emphasis on independence and authenticity. The rest of the panel becomes more engaged as well. There are occasional interjections, short comments that either support one side or attempt to reframe the discussion. These contributions help to keep the conversation from becoming too narrow, but they also highlight the underlying tension by showing that there isn't a single, unified viewpoint. One moment stands out as particularly indicative of the dynamic. Hostin poses a question about whether there is ever a point where feedback from audiences or critics becomes useful in shaping future decisions. It's a reasonable question, framed in a way that invites reflection rather than defensiveness. Cage pauses again before responding. This time, the pause is slightly longer, and he briefly looks down before speaking. When he does answer, his tone is measured, but there is a clear sense of conviction. He acknowledges that feedback can be informative, but he distinguishes between listening and conforming. He makes it clear that while he is open to perspectives, he ultimately relies on his own judgment. The way he articulates this point reinforces the overall direction of the conversation. It's not about rejecting criticism outright, it's about defining its role. His response is met with a mix of reactions from the audience, including a few nods and light applause. As the segment continues, the pacing slows slightly. The questions become more deliberate, and the responses more carefully structured. It's evident that both participants are aware of the tone and are navigating it with care. There are no interruptions or overlaps in speech, which adds to the sense of control within the conversation. For viewers, this part of the segment feels like a continuation of the earlier shift, a deeper exploration of the same themes, with a slightly more focused edge. The disagreement remains subtle, expressed through differences in emphasis rather than any overt conflict. And as the discussion moves forward, the balance between maintaining a respectful dialogue and addressing those differences becomes even more central, setting up the next phase of the exchange where the conversation begins to feel more pointed, even while staying within the boundaries of daytime television. As the segment continues, the conversation settles into a more focused and deliberate pace, with both Nicolas Cage and Sunny Hostin clearly aware that they are now discussing something more layered than a typical promotional interview. The tone remains calm, but there is less room for generalities. Each question and response feels more intentional, with both sides carefully choosing how they present their perspectives. Cage maintains his forward-leaning posture, signaling continued engagement. His expression is serious but not tense, and his delivery remains steady. Hostin mirrors that composure, her tone consistent, her phrasing precise. Around them, the other hosts are watching closely, occasionally exchanging glances that suggest they recognize the direction the conversation has taken. At this point, Hostin shifts slightly in her approach. Rather than asking broadly about career decisions, she introduces a more specific angle. She references how certain performances in Cage's career have been described as unconventional or unexpected, noting that these choices sometimes divide audiences. Her wording is careful, but the implication is clear. She is asking him to address not just the choices themselves, but the reactions they generate. Cage listens without interrupting, his eyes focused on her as she speaks. When she finishes, there is a brief pause. It's not uncomfortable, but it is noticeable, the kind of pause that signals a transition from general discussion to a more pointed exchange. When he responds, his tone remains even, but there is a slight tightening in his phrasing. He explains that he has always viewed acting as a form of expression that allows for a wide range of interpretation. From his perspective, not every performance is meant to be universally understood or accepted in the same way. He emphasizes that unpredictability can be part of what keeps the work meaningful, both for himself and for audiences who are open to different approaches. As he speaks, one of the co-hosts nods in agreement, briefly adding that some of the most memorable performances in film history were initially met with mixed reactions. The comment draws a small round of applause from the audience, which briefly lightens the atmosphere. However, Hostin continues to build on her point. She acknowledges that experimentation can be valuable, but she raises the question of accessibility. Her concern, as she frames it, is whether certain choices might make it harder for broader audiences to connect with the work. It's a subtle shift, but it introduces a new layer to the discussion, one that focuses on the relationship between artistic intent and audience reception. Cage's response comes more quickly this time. He nods once, as if recognizing the validity of the question, but his answer carries a slightly firmer tone than before. He explains that connection does not always come from familiarity. In some cases, he says, it comes from presenting something that challenges expectations. He is careful not to dismiss the importance of audience engagement, but he makes it clear that he does not see accessibility as the primary goal. The exchange remains respectful, but the contrast in viewpoints is now more defined. Hostin's questions consistently return to the idea of audience perspective, while Cage's responses emphasize the importance of creative autonomy. Neither interrupts the other, but the rhythm of the conversation has become more direct. Another host steps in, attempting to reframe the discussion in a way that incorporates both perspectives. She suggests that there may be a balance between experimentation and audience connection, asking Cage whether he consciously thinks about that balance when choosing roles. The question introduces a middle ground, and for a moment, it seems like the conversation might move in that direction. Cage considers the question briefly before answering. His tone softens slightly, and he acknowledges that balance can be important in certain contexts. However, he reiterates that his primary focus is on the authenticity of the project itself. If a role feels genuine to him, he is willing to take the risk, even if it does not align perfectly with audience expectations. The audience reacts with quiet attentiveness, followed by a few scattered claps. The response suggests that viewers are engaged, even if the conversation is more serious than usual for this type of segment. It's the kind of moment that stands out not because of any dramatic escalation, but because of the clarity with which both sides are expressing their views. Hostin listens closely, then responds with a comment that brings the discussion back to a broader cultural context. She notes that public figures often influence how audiences think about art and entertainment, whether intentionally or not. Her point is that with that influence comes a certain level of responsibility, even if it is not explicitly defined. This remark marks another subtle shift in the tone. It's not confrontational, but it introduces a perspective that places Cage's choices within a larger framework. The implication is that his decisions have an impact beyond his own creative process. Cage's reaction is measured, but there is a noticeable firmness in how he responds. He acknowledges the idea of influence, but he reframes it in a way that aligns with his earlier points. He explains that influence, in his view, comes from authenticity rather than conformity. By staying true to his own approach, he believes he is contributing to a broader understanding of what acting can be. As he speaks, his delivery becomes slightly more deliberate. He is not speaking faster or louder, but there is a clear emphasis on certain ideas. His eye contact remains steady, and his posture reflects a sense of conviction. It's evident that he is fully engaged in the discussion and intent on articulating his perspective clearly. The rest of the panel responds in different ways. One host nods in agreement, while another offers a brief counterpoint, suggesting that audience expectations can also shape the success of a project. These interjections are brief and measured, but they add to the sense that the conversation is exploring multiple angles. The audience remains attentive throughout, with occasional applause punctuating key moments. There is no sense of discomfort, but there is a clear awareness that the discussion has moved beyond typical promotional territory. It feels more like a thoughtful exchange of ideas than a standard interview. At this stage, the pacing of the segment slows even further. Each question is followed by a carefully considered response, and there are fewer attempts to shift the topic. Instead, the conversation stays focused on the central themes that have emerged: creative independence, audience expectations, and the role of public perception. One particularly telling moment comes when Hostin asks whether Cage ever worries about being misunderstood. The question is framed gently, but it touches on a personal aspect of the discussion. For a brief moment, the energy in the studio shifts again, becoming slightly more introspective. Cage pauses before answering, his expression thoughtful. When he speaks, his tone is calm, but there is a subtle change in how he approaches the question. He acknowledges that misunderstanding is always a possibility, especially when taking creative risks. However, he explains that he has come to accept that as part of the process. His response is met with a quiet, appreciative reaction from the audience. It's not a moment of tension, but rather one of reflection. For a few seconds, the conversation feels less like a debate and more like a shared exploration of a complex topic. Still, the underlying difference in perspective remains. Hostin continues to emphasize the importance of audience connection and responsibility, while Cage consistently returns to the idea of authenticity and independence. The exchange is balanced, but it is also clear that neither side is fully shifting their position. As the segment moves forward, the hosts begin to prepare for a transition, but the discussion hasn't fully resolved. The tone remains composed, the pacing steady, and the engagement from both sides consistent. What began as a routine conversation has now become a sustained, thoughtful exchange, one that continues to unfold in real time. And as the conversation approaches its next phase, there is a sense that the most direct and defining moments of the discussion are still ahead, with both participants holding firmly to their viewpoints while maintaining the respectful tone expected on the view. As the conversation moves further along, the tone that has been building throughout the segment becomes more defined. It remains calm and controlled, but there is now very little distance between the questions being asked and the core of the disagreement. Sunny Hostin appears more direct in how she frames her points, while Nicolas Cage continues to respond with a steady, deliberate firmness that reflects his position without escalating the situation. Cage's posture remains forward, his hands now more visibly engaged as he speaks, occasionally opening slightly to emphasize a point before returning to rest. His expression is focused, not defensive, but clearly attentive to the direction of the conversation. Hostin maintains her composure, her tone even, but her questions now carry a sharper clarity. The discussion has moved beyond general observations and into a more precise exchange of ideas. One of the co-hosts briefly attempts to introduce a lighter note, referencing how audiences often rediscover performances years later and view them differently over time. The comment draws a soft reaction from the audience, a few nods and a small ripple of laughter, but it doesn't significantly alter the trajectory of the conversation. The focus quickly returns to the central theme. Hostin leans slightly forward and introduces a point that reframes the discussion in a more practical way. She asks whether there is ever a point where artistic independence and public reception need to meet somewhere in the middle, not in theory, but in real decision-making. Her tone is not confrontational, but the phrasing suggests a desire for a more concrete answer. There is a brief silence as Cage listens. He nods once, acknowledging the question, and then takes a measured breath before responding. His answer is calm, but more direct than earlier responses. He explains that while compromise can exist in collaborative environments, the initial decision to take on a role is something he believes must come from a place of personal conviction. Without that, he suggests, the work itself would feel less genuine. As he speaks, there is a slight shift in the audience's attention, people leaning in, focusing more closely. It's the kind of moment where the conversation feels less like an interview and more like a thoughtful exchange that requires listening. Hostin responds by clarifying her perspective. She emphasizes that her questions are not about limiting creativity, but about understanding how public figures navigate influence and expectation in a very visible space. Her tone softens slightly as she makes this distinction, which helps maintain the balance of the conversation. Cage acknowledges this clarification with a small nod. However, when he responds, he reinforces his earlier point with slightly stronger emphasis. He explains that influence, in his view, should not be something that restricts choices. Instead, he believes it should emerge naturally from the work itself. He is careful in his wording, but the consistency of his position is clear. At this stage, the exchange becomes more about reaffirming perspectives than introducing new ideas. Hostin continues to explore the implications of his viewpoint, while Cage consistently brings the conversation back to the importance of creative independence. The back and forth is steady, without interruption, but there is a noticeable firmness on both sides. Another co-host steps in again, this time addressing Cage directly with a question about how he interprets audience feedback after a project is released. The tone of this question is neutral, almost reflective, and it briefly shifts the focus away from the earlier tension. Cage responds by describing how he listens to feedback without allowing it to define his next steps. He explains that while he values the perspectives of viewers and critics, he approaches each new project independently. His tone here is slightly more relaxed, offering a momentary easing of the intensity. The audience responds with light applause, and for a moment, the energy in the studio feels more balanced again. But as has happened earlier in the segment, the shift is temporary. Hostin re-enters with a question that brings the discussion back to its central point, asking whether there is ever a sense of responsibility to meet audiences halfway, particularly in projects that reach wide audiences. Her phrasing is careful, but the repetition of the theme underscores its importance to her perspective. Cage's reaction is composed, but there is a subtle change in his delivery. He leans in slightly more, his voice still calm but carrying a clearer sense of finality. He explains that while he respects the audience, he does not believe that meeting expectations should come at the expense of authenticity. He emphasizes that the connection between performer and audience is strongest when it is based on honesty rather than calculation. The clarity of his response creates a brief pause in the conversation. The audience remains quiet, absorbing what has been said. There is no immediate applause this time, just a moment of stillness that reflects the seriousness of the exchange. The other hosts begin to step in more actively, sensing that the conversation has reached a point where it needs to be balanced carefully. One host offers a comment about how different artists approach this balance in different ways, suggesting that there is no single correct answer. Another adds that the diversity of approaches is part of what keeps the industry dynamic. These contributions help to broaden the discussion again, but they also highlight the core difference that has been present throughout the segment. Hostin's perspective consistently emphasizes connection and responsibility, while Cage's responses focus on independence and authenticity. As the segment nears its final moments, the pacing becomes slightly quicker. There is an awareness that time is limited, and the hosts begin to guide the conversation toward a natural conclusion. However, the tone remains steady, without any abrupt shifts or forced resolutions. One final exchange between Hostin and Cage stands out. She asks, in a more reflective tone, whether he believes that his approach has changed how audiences understand his work over time. The question is less pointed than earlier ones, but it still ties directly into the themes they have been discussing. Cage takes a moment before answering, his expression thoughtful. He explains that he hopes his work encourages audiences to remain open to different forms of expression. He reiterates that his goal has never been to fit into a specific mold, but to explore the possibilities within his craft. His answer is delivered with the same calm firmness that has defined his responses throughout the segment. It does not directly counter Hostin's perspective, but it clearly reinforces his own. The audience responds with a more sustained round of applause this time, signaling appreciation for the thoughtful nature of the exchange. The tension that had built earlier does not disappear, but it settles into a more reflective tone. The hosts begin to transition, offering brief closing remarks and acknowledging Cage's presence on the show. The conversation, while not fully resolved, has reached a natural stopping point. Both perspectives have been expressed clearly, without escalation or disruption. For viewers watching The View, This portion of the segment stands out as the most defined part of the discussion, a moment where differing viewpoints were explored in a direct but respectful way. And as the segment prepares to close, the focus shifts from the exchange itself to how it will be received beyond the studio, setting the stage for the final moments and the broader reaction that follows. As the segment reaches its closing moments, the energy in the studio shifts from active discussion to a more reflective calm. The exchange between Nicolas Cage and Sunny Hostin has run its course without any dramatic resolution, but it has clearly left an impression, both on the panel and on the audience watching in real time. One of the co-hosts steps in to guide the conversation toward a conclusion, offering a brief summary of the discussion. She acknowledges the different perspectives that were shared, noting that the conversation highlighted how artists approach their work in distinct ways. Her tone is warm and neutral, serving as a bridge between the more focused exchange that just took place and the broader format of the show. Hostin nods as the summary is delivered, her posture relaxed again compared to earlier moments. When she speaks, her tone reflects that same sense of balance. She thanks Cage for engaging in the discussion and briefly reiterates that conversations like this are valuable because they offer viewers insight into how public figures think about their work and their role in the industry. There is no tension in her delivery at this point, just a professional closing that aligns with the tone of daytime television. Cage responds with a short, composed acknowledgement. He thanks the panel for the conversation and reiterates, in a concise way, that he appreciates the opportunity to discuss his perspective. His tone has softened slightly compared to the more focused moments earlier, and his posture reflects that shift as well. He leans back just a bit, signaling that the most intense part of the discussion has passed. The audience responds with a steady round of applause, louder and more unified than at earlier points in the segment. It's the kind of reaction that reflects appreciation rather than excitement, an acknowledgement of a thoughtful conversation rather than a dramatic moment. Some audience members nod as they clap, suggesting that they were engaged with the discussion even if it wasn't typical light daytime content. As the camera angle widens slightly, the rest of the panel joins in the closing remarks. One host briefly references Cage's latest project again, bringing the segment back to its original purpose. Another adds a quick comment about how conversations like this show the importance of having different viewpoints represented. These remarks are brief, but they help bring the segment full circle. The transition to the next segment begins smoothly. The show moves into a lighter tone, with a teaser for what's coming up next. The shift is noticeable but not abrupt. It's handled in the same way that the view typically moves between topics, maintaining continuity while adjusting the energy. However, for viewers watching live, the exchange that just took place lingers. It stands out not because of any overt conflict, but because of how clearly both perspectives were expressed. The conversation didn't rely on raised voices or interruptions. Instead, it unfolded through careful questions and deliberate responses, creating a moment that felt grounded and real. After the episode airs, the reaction begins to build beyond the studio. Clips of the exchange start circulating online, particularly the moments where Cage speaks most directly about creative independence and authenticity. Viewers share short segments, often focusing on the contrast between his responses and Hostin's questions. On social media, the response is mixed but engaged. Some viewers express support for Cage's emphasis on artistic freedom, agreeing with his perspective that creativity should not be limited by external expectations. Others align more with Hostin's viewpoint, highlighting the importance of audience connection and the influence that public figures hold. What stands out in these reactions is that the discussion is treated seriously. Rather than becoming a source of controversy, it becomes a point of conversation. Viewers discuss the ideas that were raised, often referencing specific moments from the segment to support their perspectives. Media outlets that cover daytime television also pick up on the exchange, describing it as a thoughtful and measured discussion rather than a heated disagreement. The framing remains consistent with how it appeared on air, focused, respectful, and grounded in differing viewpoints rather than conflict. In the hours following the broadcast, additional context begins to emerge from post-show discussions. Some of the hosts briefly reference the segment in later appearances or interviews, noting that it was an example of how meaningful conversations can take place even within the structure of a daytime talk show. The emphasis remains on the value of dialogue rather than any sense of dispute. Cage's comments are also referenced in entertainment coverage, particularly his remarks about authenticity and creative direction. These quotes are shared widely, often presented as part of a broader conversation about how actors navigate long careers in a changing industry. For regular viewers of The View, The segment becomes one of those moments that stands out not for its intensity, but for its clarity. It reflects the kind of discussion that can happen when a guest engages fully with the panel, and when the hosts are willing to explore a topic in depth. By the end of the day, the exchange has settled into the ongoing cycle of talk show coverage, referenced, discussed, and gradually absorbed into the larger conversation about entertainment and media. It does not escalate into anything beyond that, but it leaves a lasting impression on those who watched it closely. And as the narration comes to a close, the moment serves as a reminder of how live television can create space for real, unscripted dialogue, where different perspectives are shared, examined, and left for the audience to consider. If you watched this exchange, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.